Hello, my name is Ken Irvin and I work at the Institute of Water Education in Delft in the Netherlands. In this advanced course on freshwater health, you have heard about the structure and function of freshwater habitats, and I would now like to develop some ideas about the ecosystem services provided by freshwaters and how they relate to ecosystem processes. I will cover two aspects in this video. Firstly, the overview of freshwater ecosystem services, and secondly, the processes and functions supporting freshwater ecosystem services. If we recall from the first session on ecosystem services in the fundamentals module, the services can be classified into different types. These are commonly provisioning, regulating, and cultural services. A fourth category often used is supporting services. These are sometimes amalgamated with the regulating services. In the following slides, I provide an overview of some examples of commonly recognized ecosystem services and their description. There are many types of freshwater ecosystems, but usually we can recognize the same or very similar types and services working across the different water body types within the categories of wetlands, rivers, and lakes. Wetlands support water quality purification, flood protection, shoreline erosion control, and aesthetic appeal. They cover, of course, aspects of ecosystem services from habitat structure, the supporting service, provisioning services, which provide produce and products from those wetlands, regulating services in terms of the control of water movement and nutrients, and of course, as illustrated with aesthetic appreciation, cultural services. Similar ecosystem services are derived from streams and rivers, water supply, flood protection, recreation, for example, and from standing waters, ponds and lakes, including resilience to climate change, flood protection again, and of course, recreation and cultural appreciation. A general summary of the multiple benefits the ecosystems provide from wetlands was provided by the TEEB team on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. Underlying ecosystem processes manifest as functions providing services for human benefit. Inland waters provide multiple services and benefits as illustrated in the slide. But now I'd like us to think about a little quiz, and looking at the previous slide, I would like you to suggest an ecological process that depends on biological interactions that could be important for carbon sequestration, water purification, and recreation. Insert your answers into the box on the right-hand side, and when you have done that, we will move forward to the next slide. So take a few minutes to think about this and to put those answers in, and then we will proceed. So how did you do? How did you do in connecting biological processes to some of those ecosystem services? There are a whole variety of options you could have chosen, you could have thought about. And this slide illustrates some of the ideas and some examples of how to connect the ecosystem processes and the ecosystem functioning with the ecosystem services. If we think about those ecological processes illustrated here in the large red box, we can think about ecosystem functions to do with production of plants, terrestrial plants or phytoplankton, freshwater, macrophytes, for example. We can think about the productivity of the animals or the plants which are in those water bodies. We can think about how the carbon is cycled, the carbon flux, the carbon sequestration, the carbon storage, the nutrient cycling, nitrogen, phosphorus, and other nutrients, and how they move around the ecosystem, and of course the water cycle itself. All of those cycles, all of those processes depend on all of those functions depend on individual ecosystem processes. And if we think about the drivers of change of ecosystems, they could be varied. So drivers of change over on the right-hand side there, they can be related to land use changes, for example, climate change, various pollution, whether it's nutrients or other forms of pollutants, natural resource exploitation, such as fishing, and invasive species, invasion of species into habitats, which can cause a major problem and cause a change in the functioning of the ecosystems. All of these impact with the biodiversity within those ecosystems, and that includes the genetic biodiversity, the distribution and adaptation of plants and animals, which affects the distribution, the abundance, and indeed sometimes the extinction of species. We can think about how different organisms perform in different ways, which we consider in terms of functional groups. Is something a predator? Is something a herbivore? Is something especially adapted to using microbial loops within a lake, for example? And all of those affect the total species diversity and the community composition and the interactions within those communities. And of course, affect themselves. They are affected by and they have consequences for the habitat and distribution of the plants and animals within a freshwater ecosystem. Collectively, these ecosystem functioning connected to the biodiversity provides benefits for humankind. As we've discussed already, the provisioning services, the production of food, wood, bioenergy, for example, clean water, the regulating services, climate, water flow, the quality of sediment, pollination in the vicinity of freshwater systems, and pests and diseases, and of course a whole range of cultural services. They collectively support a quality of life, and that's the whole point. Ecosystem services support quality of life and they support human well-being. And there are various indirect drivers as well as direct drivers which also affect this whole process, whether it's to do with awareness, education, or health, and other things which perhaps are not quite so obvious as the direct drivers. This diagram comes from work by the Intergovernmental Science and Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and this is a diagram modified from the website, which you can see there. So this slide provides a less detailed but a useful summary of the physical, chemical, and biological processes that interact to provide those emergent ecosystem properties and those ecological functions that support and lead to ecosystem services. So water infiltration, nutrient transformations, contaminant removal, for example, primary production, groundwater recharge, these are typical functions within a freshwater ecosystem which support and provide those ecosystem services. Those ecosystem services are, as we have discussed, can be a large variety of types: clean water, recreation again, flood and erosion control, and of course a whole variety of provisioning services, including food. Those ecosystem services can be subject to environmental valuation, and there's a big discussion about the merits of valuing ecosystems. Some people consider it's a commodification of the environment. Another point of view is that if you can put monetary value on an ecosystem and ecosystem services, then that's a strong argument for its protection, and it's actually a strong argument to really assess the value of that ecosystem for support of ecosystem services and for human well-being. So we'll come to that a little bit more in a little while. A great example of the effect of the functioning of ecosystems on ecosystem services is a seasonal inundation of floodplains. Floodplains offer a range of services. When wetted, there is often a nutrient pulse that fuels biological production, essential for fish. Many fish use floodplains as a key component of their life cycle, especially as a breeding ground and as a nurturing area. Intact floodplains also provide a regulating service to slow down and store water during flood events. In this way, and using flood protection as an example, it is then possible to connect biophysical structure of an ecosystem with the underlying processes important for ecosystem services, leading to human well-being. If we have the notion of services, then maybe we also have to think about disservice. If ecosystem services are portrayed as of beneficial use to humans, then what happens when human activities impact those processes and consequently the service they provide? A classic example is provided by nutrients in freshwater bodies. Biological production depends on the availability of nutrients that enable cellular functions and organisms to grow and develop. We add nutrients to crops because this enhances growth. But when those nutrients leach out to fresh waters, they change the makeup and balance of communities and often the very character of the water body itself. Under low nutrient conditions, we normally expect water bodies to have clear water, often with a high diversity of organisms, all competing with each other for the scarce and valuable nutrients on which they depend. But when nutrient loads increase, particularly of nitrogen and phosphorus, these can lead to effects that can alter ecosystem structure, often with dramatic effects. This was first recognized by the Swedish botanist and limnologist Einar Naumann in the 1930s, who talked about how the amount of algae in a lake was determined primarily by nutrients nitrogen and phosphorus and correlated with what he called the structure of the catchment. In 1931, Naumann defined eutrophication as an increase in nutritive substances. Along with Naumann, there were several other workers in the early part of the 20th century who were focusing on the effects of nutrient enrichment on the water quality, particularly of lakes. A couple of quotes illustrates the point quite well. Linked to algal blooms in Lake Monona, close to the city of Madison, Sarah reports, all the evidence appears to show conclusively that the offensive smells from Lake Monona during the summer of 1918 were caused by algae produced in great abundance. And Hasler in 1947 talked about domestic fertilization causing obnoxious scums of algae that discolored the water and the shore, and upon decomposition produce foul odors. Boating and swimming become uninviting. So when we think about those consequences of nutrients on freshwater ecosystems, there's another little quiz here. This is a simple true or false answer. The first question is, concentrations found in highly enriched waters dissolved phosphate is poisonous to fish. Is it true or is it false? Secondly, troublesome concentrations of phytoplankton always require high concentrations of nitrate. Is that true or is that false? Thirdly, removal of some species of fish from a lake can improve water quality. True or false? And finally, algal scums are smelly because they produce too much oxygen. Is it true or is it false? The final slide in this first session on ecosystem services is to illustrate the consequence of a variety of impacts from nutrient enrichment, but also invasive species, both for plants and invasive species of animals. In Lake Victoria, a combination of nutrient enrichment over the last 40 years or so, the invasive species water hyacinth and the invasive species the Nile perch have all come together to dramatically alter the structure and function of the ecosystem and the ecosystem services that provides. The nutrients fuel the water hyacinth. The Nile perch impacts upon the natural indigenous species of fish within the lake and their trophic interactions. And the increased nutrients and the predation of Nile perch on other fish is probably a major factor why the small native dagar species, small cyprinid in the lake, has increased and is now the major food producer in that lake. Lake Victoria has a high importance for the livelihoods of millions of people, and the ecosystem services which it provides are a mainstream of the ecological health and the food production of that lake. And as ecosystem services have declined because of the impacts, this also has large social and economic consequences. Okay, thanks very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.